It's my pleasure to welcome everyone here today. This is a really exciting program that we've been working with the FDA and our MCERC Center for the past several months, and I'll speak a little bit about what that means. One of the sort of most biggest growing, fastest growing sources of big data, and I know everyone hears big data in their day-to-day conversations and on the news and from the trade press to the popular press to even People magazine these days. But there's some really exciting opportunities to potentially harness this data in new ways to help understand and get signals about a variety of things in the medical space and the public health space. And one potential application of this data is in medical product safety. Many of the traditional ways of sort of evaluating regulated devices and other health products is, you run studies, you may assemble large cohorts, and it can be a very sort of time-consuming, resource-intensive process. And it creates, a lot of good work, but there's hope and promise that through some new sources of information, such as social media, mobile health, sensors, apps, applications, that there might be ways to use that data to help make decisions for regulators and clinicians and scientists and other. So thinking about these questions and getting to a point where we can apply that data in a rigorous way, we're probably at the sort of early stages of that as a domain and an industry. But there's a lot of people that are thinking about these questions and doing work in this space. And doing experiments and trying out new things and finding things that are really providing some sort of exciting possibilities for the future. So around sort of that sort of general theme, my colleagues at the Center for Health Information and Decision Systems, which is a health IT research center that's based in the Smith School of Business here at the University of Maryland College Park. And we've been around since 2006, founded by Professor Ritu Agarwal and a gentleman named Corey Yanks. You'll hear from Professor Agarwal in a little bit. But really, how can we use information systems to affect a variety of health outcomes? And one of our key areas of focus in the last couple of years, and for our partnerships and others, is around sort of healthcare analytics and making sense of this data. So when MCERC, which is the Center of Excellence in Regulatory Science Innovation, it's a U.S. Food and Drug Administration funded center to look at a variety of themes, but helping to sort of do innovative research and science to support the regulatory decision-making mission. They provide an opportunity to do workshops and other programs. We sort of got together and along with our colleagues at the FDA and thought about first of all, we thought, well, this is obviously an interesting area, and there's a lot of developments going on, and new ways of thinking about this. But what can we do to sort of bring the conversation ahead and develop the evidence and know that we're even sort of asking the right questions and come up with some sort of ideas for how we sort of move this ahead in the future. So with that, we bring you today's workshop, and for those of you who are on social media, you can use the hashtag MCERC15. Let's see. So today's schedule. So we're going to have our keynote in just a minute, and I'll introduce Dr. Henry Francis. Then we'll have a panel on mobile informatics. We'll have several breaks during the day. We'll have a social media panel, which will also include a really cool software demo. And then we'll have some closing remarks, and then we'll leave some time for networking. But we also appreciate this. This is a Friday afternoon. It's a beautiful day here on campus, and we want this to be highly interactive. So there's a lot of sort of brain power and excitement and sort of an interesting mix of folks in the room from both sort of academia, from government agencies, from industry, pharma, and other places. So as we have these discussions, I strongly encourage you to, as you have questions, to get engaged with the conversation. All the presentations will be available in the video online after today's event within the next week or so. But with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce sort of a pioneer in the sort of use of data applied to regulatory decision making and really across sort of a variety of health research and development activities. Dr. Henry Francis currently is the Director of Data Mining and Informatics of the Data Mining Informatics Evaluation Research Team in the Office of Translational Sciences at the Food and Drug Administration. And in that capacity, he directs a transdisciplinary group of senior scientists to test, create, and operate data analysis programs to sort of facilitate the efficient use of scientific methods and use of complex data information for regulatory decisions around drug approval and drug safety. So some of his specific interests are around the development of data mining techniques to enhance pharmacovigilance capabilities. I won't read you all his storied, excellent background, but he is an MD. I did his internal medicine residency at the Long Beach Veterans Administration Hospital. He's an assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine's Division of Infectious Diseases. And he's also worked at the NIH as a basically clinical researcher, and as well as directed the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Francis to share with us his perspectives on making use of this complex data and help sort of spark this conversation. So with that, let me ask you to the podium. I'll pull your slides up. All right, with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here today. It's the first time in my life I've ever been called a pioneer. I can't repeat what my kids call me, but we'll try to do different things. What I'll do today is give you a perspective of how I got here, how we should go someplace together and do different kinds of things, what FDA does, and then explain in a story format how I approach the subject, and then get into social media. So how I got here. My first interaction with looking at rapid data analysis was actually quite a few years ago. I was a very happy parasitic researcher at NIH. My lab chief came up and said, Francis, we're going to send you to Africa and give you $4 million. I said, okay, where am I going and why? He said, well, we're going to attach you to the ambassador. We just want you to do the studies. You'll get your orders when you get there. And I should have known there was a problem because the orders come from the Department of State and the Department of Defense. Now, look, I'm a young researcher. Why would they even want to know my name? But anyway, they gave me an allowance. They told me that I could go to the Air Force and get a plane. I got a plane equivalent to a C-117 to take 80 tons of equipment straight to Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Land with 80 tons of equipment. Now this area in Kinshasa, Zaire at the time, is on a river plateau. Very peaceful, huge river, and mosquitoes everywhere. They wouldn't even let me get off the plane. I got one step out, and the DCM, the Deputy Chief of Mission, gave me my orders. Dr. Francis, while I'm swatting mosquitoes, like this, your job is to decide if mosquitoes transmit this new disease that's killing everybody. We completed the study in a hospital there in 1 week. It was myself and another guy from CDC. It turned out to be the early epidemic of AIDS that was heavily sexually transmitted in Africa. During the time I was there, it killed 22,060 people. All of them died within 3 years. But through that experience, I learned that the importance of information and getting insight about diseases, movement of diseases, population dynamics, got me to these kinds of things that we're going to talk about today. Now, what does FDA do? Now, I'm going to speak specifically about my center, which regulates drugs. In there, it has two major functions: approve drugs and make sure they're safe. In the drug approval, there's a certain kind of information process that you use to prove that the drug is as good or better than what's already on the market. That means that we normally have to review about a 1 million page submission with all the proofs that we need to analyze. So there's an analytic issue there. On the safety side, you have to decide, well, is the drug really safe? And where would you look to find out if it's safe? And that's the core of the conversation today. It used to be that we just rely on spontaneous reports, which means the patient would complain to the pharmaceutical companies. They would write up the report and send it to us, and we were looking for specific cases, those that had severe problems, malformations, death, and stuff like that. But that turns out to be only 4% of what we need to see. So the question was, and the reason I started working on the data mining group, was what about the other 96%? Is spontaneous reporting enough? Are there other things we need to see? Well, what is the core job of FDA? Got the wrong button here. Where do I point this? There we go. This is the job of FDA, believe it or not. We have to be able to distinguish things that have very common attributes, but are actually quite different. Now, for those of you that are IT savvy, I challenge you to be able to write a single program that can reliably distinguish between those pictures. Because think about it. All of them have two eyes, a nose, and a mouth. Well, they're all the same. Well, no, they're not. Well, maybe it's the hair on their face. Well, kind of have hair in the face. A round face. Well, at least two of them look the same. So this is what we're doing through 3,000 reports every day, trying to make those distinctions. And we use different kinds of tools to get there. Yeah, I haven't figured that out, so I'll just use the, yeah, yep. So let's talk about the questions that we were asked to talk about today. And this is just my viewpoint, and it's as a regulator looking out at the world. There's actually a different question if you're outside looking in at what FDA wants to be done. So for example, I was just down in Florida yesterday, and industry was very interested in the fact, well, if a side effect of a drug is reported in social media, what is our responsibility as far as reporting it or reacting to it? I don't have the answer to that, but I'm not going to be able to answer that question today. So I'm just talking about when we receive information, how do we assemble the information that we receive, and what other information do we need to get a three-dimensional view of a problem? So I'll use it as an example of the mobile health and social media, which is a part of what we do. And by mobile health, what I mean is that devices that people have on hand can be used to report things that FDA needs to know. The tools and technology for real-time analysis, and let me define that. It's not IT real-time, which is streaming information, but being able to make a decision within 24 hours to a week is normally real-time for FDA, or at least CEDAR. There are a lot of methodologic opportunities, which we'll talk about a little bit, though we have other experts that will talk about that in more detail. We have to understand that even though information is sort of like a neutral feature, it's not for the people who are sending the information. We have to have a lot of understanding about that and recognize that at some point, all of us are going to say, we're making regulatory decisions on social media, but do the people who send the messages want us to do that? That's not been resolved yet, but something we have to be get more savvy about. And the last one is just data standards, which is a very controversial area. I won't go into that. But interoperability, the ability to link a number of different things, is a key feature. And for example, in our group, we collaborate with a very good ontologist, Asaya Yu's over there, way over her hand. And it's what we're looking at is the ability to link, say, genomic data, regulatory data, other biologic data in a way so that when I look at a screen, I get a three-dimensional view of what's going on. That's, I think, the long-range goal of using social media and other data sources to make regulatory decisions. The key underlying principle is one that, the citation is a little bit small, but you'd be able to read it. The National Academy of Sciences had a group talking about convergence. What it means is that all of us here are no longer separate individuals working in our specialities, but are actually beginning to converge in a sort of more transdisciplinary way to be able to more effectively do our analyses. It takes a little while to wrap your head around it, but that's what our data mining team does. We have a diverse group of people, so we all understand platform design. We all understand systems implications, but we also know how to do review data. And all of us will eventually evolve into some combination of those hybrid skills to be effective in using not only social media, but any other data source. What are the data sources? Now, right now, CEDAR focuses on the one that's on the top right. It's called spontaneous reports. On an average year, we get about 1.5 million reports. That's only 1 to 4% of all potential reports that could be sent to the FDA. So we make a lot of our regulatory decisions on a very small snapshot of what's happening in the world. What the data mining team is doing is looking at other information sources, and this is from an article that Robbie Harpez wrote back about 3 years ago. Looking at health records, electronic health records, what does that tell you? Looking at clinical trials, what does that tell you? And all the way around the circle there, all those information sources have something to tell us. And it's our responsibility to look at that information and try to synthesize what it means for us. I can give you a great example, but I'll do that at the end of the talk of where that could make a big difference. But the whole theme is that social media is an important part of this, but it's part of many different streams of information that we all have to look at least in a regulatory sense, to make sure that we find all the possible causes of adverse events, and more importantly, maybe able to model and anticipate adverse events to prevent them from getting to the market. Because remember, when we release a drug, it's tested in about 12,000 people. And then when it's put on the market, it may go up to about 60 million people. When you have that expansion of use, there will be somebody who dies. There will be people who get sick. And there'll be several thousand who have other kinds of less important side effects, but significant side effects. If there was some way to anticipate that, that'd be very important. And that's where a fusion of information analysis would be very important. The other part of when I say data mining, this is what I mean. And just to translate it for you, data mining is not a single process, but a consortium of activities to allow us to see patterns and clusters of information in any information source. So that means we have to be good at data visualization. We work with the Human-Computer Interaction Lab here on the Maryland campus. Data architecture is actually quite important. If you don't have the right architecture, you can't store the data for recovery at a later point to do analysis, and there's a lot of technical reasons for that. Everybody knows about decision making, which is that center square, in that you use a tool to find statistically a pattern you want to look at and analyze. But there's several other features in it you have to do. We assume that when we analyze a particular data set over and over again, we get the same result. Well, at FDA, since every drug that's approved is a unique circumstance, we can't make that assumption. So there's a number of features around and underneath analytic decisions that have to be accounted for when we do our data mining. So let's go to the first question that was posed in the workshop, in the mobile health and social media. And what I'll do there is go to a use case where we came up with a solution, just see what you think about it. That's Rapid. It's a system. Now, unlike most things that we did at Cedar, where we have a single tool that resolves a problem, we designed a system to answer a particular problem. Now, Rapid stands for a real-time application for programmable interactive devices. Okay, it's a branding name, but what it means, mobile phone-based reporting. Let me give you what the problem was. And at the time that I was working in the surveillance office, there was the huge H1N1 epidemic around 2007. The features of that disease was it was killing a lot of people, and the conventional drugs that we use were oral, and there was resistance to it. Now, there was one drug within FDA that theoretically could kill the virus, but it was not approved. So how do you get an unapproved drug out into the United States, and then more importantly, assess it to see whether it works or not? Now, the way we did it was basically by telephone, telegraph, smoke signals, but there was no intelligent system to acquire the information. So unfortunately, we weren't able to assess whether it worked or not. But we were able to find out what the problems were and how to mitigate those things in future emergencies. And that was the genesis of the Rapid system, which you see here in summary. It has 5 parts to it. First is looking at the mobile phone itself, asking questions that a person can transmit. Now, we notice this particular problem that's just worth noting is that FDA has an approved form, but it takes 38 minutes to fill it out. So we did a speech-to-text translation. You can do it in about 5 minutes, and then you get a lot more information. So little details like that can actually define the system. And then without getting into details of the rest of it, we have a cloud-based system that receives the information, can analyze it in real time, and then more importantly, once we make a decision, can send a message in multiple media formats back to the sender within 24 hours. So the systematic bidirectional communication is one aspect that's very important in a lot of the systems and data that's being reported to FDA. That in the bottom right is a visual way that we look at large amounts of data. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Second feature, tools and technology for real-time analysis and methodologic opportunities and challenges. The first one is acquiring the information. Now, this is a very archaic, this is a wire diagram of what the actual RAPID project looks like if you have it on the phone. But there's a lot of technology in trying to acquire information from people who maybe has health background, do not have health background, different vocabularies, different approaches. The opportunity methodology is how to assess what's the best way to ask the right question of different people. It's not particularly easy, but it is one that requires some systematic analysis. And the reason you can say that is looking at the work that Epidemico and others have done, looking at how people discuss health in the general population. They use a different vocabulary. It's not a large part of what they talk about. But if you ask the right question for picking up things that they say, you might be able to identify important issues. On the receiving end, one of the nightmares of FDA is that you open up the electronic gateways that allow people to report stuff. Now, up until 2 years ago, 1.5 million reports were read manually by about 45 different reviewers. And so when I started talking about RAPID, and that we can get 4 million reports in about 3 months, I almost caused a massive heart attack epidemic. And what we had to do in terms of the methodology is switch from the preferred method of reading things in detail, a great deal of reliance on humans being able to pick up patterns, to be able to use technology to cone down and focus on particular areas that have a pattern. Now for that, and I'll show you a slide later, I used my brother-in-law, who's a long-distance truck driver. If Stanley approves it, I know it's easy enough for anybody to use. And that's the core theory behind a lot of the graphic kinds of information. The basic thing, even though there's a lot of configurations you see here, is a focus on the bottom central one. What I told Stanley was, Stanley, red is bad, green is good. What do you think? He says, well, that particular box seems to have a lot of red. What's the problem? That's what visualization does. In this case, this particular antibody causes immune suppression, so there's a lot of problems around the heart and infections, and that's what the red indication is telling you. There's a lot of technology behind it, and there's a lot of research that can be done for that. But the whole idea is to be able to eliminate a lot of spurious information, particularly in something like social media, and focus on the key issues that need your individual decision making. Now, this is the official Stanley slide. And what this is comparing two drugs used for thyroid disease. And it's to use that kind of methodology to highlight a problem that actually turned out to be a major regulatory decision. In that one drug on the left, the propylthiouracil, had a number of different side effects indicated by those red squares. For your curiosity, those white squares are different organ systems of the body. The redness tells you that there's certain adverse events that are frequently reported within that organ system. And those are the ones you would investigate. So with that logic, the visualization turned out to be very important for finding a disease that literally we found with the reviewer in one day. Otherwise, when you read the reports, it's much harder to pick it up. Again, one of the big frightening things for a lot of the regulators is all this information, what Epidemico produces and others, is how do we figure out what's going on? And just very quickly, these are the visual dashboards that we use. The key one for social media is up in the top right, where you're looking at the frequency of reports over time. And the reason that's important is that social media in general, particularly Twitter and Facebook, are good for things that are big, bad, and sudden. So if you're a reviewer within FDA, if you look at the normal distribution of cases reported over time, if all of a sudden you get a peak, you know there's a problem, and we need to focus in on that. And these visual formats all do that. Now, the other thing we can do, and it's a technology that requires, I think, a lot of work from all of us, is looking at how geographic interfaces can help us. One of the things that this particular graph helped us with was that when we looked at the kinds of reports sent to us, we noticed that these particular dots seem to be highlighted in a lot of major events. And what those dots tell you is the frequency of reports, the number of people, and the location you're reporting from. You're looking at a classic distribution of lawyers looking for cases that they use for those class action suits. So we actually use this as an elimination factor where we're looking for other reports that might indicate a major problem. So sometimes visualization, even in a geographic sense, can be very important for anticipating a problem, locating a problem, or predicting where a problem might go and how to act with it. Also, as you get spread from national to international events, and now we're moving into the area of how do you represent data to people who are decision makers, is instead of this previous map, where you saw all that stuff, which probably most people didn't understand what it was about. You know, for a leader that has Congress on the phone, they want to know, well, how many people died and where are they? With this particular map, again, red is always bad. Those are people who died. So now our director can say, well, looking at the current map, we know that 2 people died in your state of California, Senator. And then she can use a feature to drill down to that particular case and give details as need to in real time. So looking at features for decision makers is equally as important as for analysts looking at different kinds of data. Now there's another feature that's technical, and I think some of you are into this kind of thing, is that right now, if you look at the information streams within the FDA, I think the largest we get up to is about 10 terabytes. You know, so we're not in the traditional big data era. You know, if anything, we're sort of like in the top left square of advanced analytics. But now as the speed of information and size increases, we have to actually modify our statistical analyses. And these are things that require some more research about how to pick up patterns when you have now streaming information that's really very large. And there's a technical issue of analysis, and then there's a mechanical issue of how to handle all that information. And we're just beginning to breach that area right now. But if we could anticipate some of those issues, and I think some of the other speakers will talk about that, it'll be very important. So the last thing, understanding trust and influence on social media, standards and interoperability. I think there's a lot of issues around social media, and then I'll talk about social media itself in it as a focus. In that I think social media needs to be defined, you know, and second, what does the social media tell us? In terms of standards and interoperability, standards I think is controversial because we're not sure we really need standards all the time. We're now developing a number of different IT capabilities where a standard data format is not as important as it used to be. It may actually become obsolete, and I'm sure some of you guys will be part of that process of determining that one way or another. Interoperability, however, is the other key, in that we tend to value specialized kinds of IT approaches. But as we move away from regular transactional kind of computations to analytic ones, we begin to realize we have to have more interoperable systems. And that requires a rethinking of the platforms that we sit under and which tools we use and when to use them. This to me is social media. Now there are hundreds of these different slides. This is from Brian Solis. Basically what it says, when we say social media, we're looking at least 150 potential sites. And they have a whole spectrum of different kinds of information. For a regulatory analyst, the key question to always ask is this a good site? But what does the site tell you? Because, for example, we tend to focus on Twitter and Facebook because they're large. But if you're looking for a pattern that's important, it may not necessarily be in a large database. It could be, for example, one recent experience looking at drug use in transgender populations. They have their own population, and within there, you can get more patterns and clusters of information than you ever could from Twitter and Facebook. So when we talk about social media, we recommend it's a vast world. It's increasing almost incrementally about every 4 to 6 months. And the whole issue is trying to understand what part of the social media does this particular site work in, and what does it tell you? Now, a lot of these slides are from the Epidemico group, and so I won't go into this in great detail because they'll be explained in more detail. But I think one thing to understand is for social media, at least from the FDA perspective, it's a huge amount of information. But if you actually look at what the information is that we need, it's actually a small percentage of that. And the question is, what does social media tell you? As Scott will tell you and others who have worked with it, that perhaps on regular surveillance, as an example, it may not be the best way to go. But however, in isolated situations, it may be more useful. There are a lot of different solutions that can be done, and I won't discuss those, it'll be discussed later. But the whole idea is the field is still wide open for a lot of ideas and approaches about how to find important clusters and patterns of issues with a large amount of data. But when you do that, remember there's always 2 parts to it. How do you find it, and which information source is most important? And then there's a third, what I call 2B, what IT platform you're operating under. Because it's actually turning out that the right platform can increase your ability to do what you need to do. The wrong one might fool you. The value of it, I think all of you know it already. it's a public discussion, which is a pro and a con, in that you have basically unregulated conversation through millions of people. But now the issue is, yes, it's public, but for the sender, should it be considered public? Now, as the meeting I was in yesterday, there was a lot of argument back and forth about that, because now we're accessing information, and it may impinge on some people's perception of privacy. A specific example, one of the things in that circle that I pointed out to you was search logs. Now, the value for a regulator in search logs is, as an example, 65 million people are regularly surveilled by Google. If you would pick out all women and then do a subset doing research on breast cancer, you can actually deduct the medical history of a woman who's had breast cancer by the searches they do. How do you biopsy for breast cancer? Complications of breast cancer surgery, complications of different chemotherapies, and then specific terms associated with the chemotherapies. You can tell what's happened to them. Important information, but then we have to counterbalance that with the privacy concerns of the individual. Those haven't been sorted out yet, but those are things we'll have to work on. The only reason I put up this slide, and again, Epidemico will explain it to you in greater detail, is the natural language processing and text mining are not easy sciences yet. So there's a tremendous need for unscrambling. How do you get the key information out of it? Now, when you look at the Epidemico tool, those added features are, well, how do you figure out if itching correlates with a medical illness? Now, again, it's like distinguishing between a human and an animal. It's obvious to us, but trying to instruct a computer to do that is extraordinarily difficult. It requires a lot of analytic power. And it's something that's a tremendous research area. There's a lot of interest in it, but at least from a regulator's point of view, it's still in its early stages about how to best use it. Because remember, for a regulator, if we make a decision on this information and it's wrong, we could hurt several thousand people. The last one, before I wind up, is we talked about a lot of different stuff, and you'll hear a great deal of details about it. But the missing piece is just, where do you do all this work? And one of the limitations that I run into, at least with the part of FDA that I work in, is they don't have quite the right IT structure for that. So there's issues about whether you should use a cloud kind of configuration, or your database needs to have an open data lake kind of structure to it. A lot of these issues, which are not part of our normal vocabulary, will end up having to be, because when you're sitting there making a decision, you say, I want to see the video of the person who has this rash in the left arm. Not all databases can produce that information. So you have to anticipate some of those issues. Now, in the RAPID study, we'll get text information, photos, videos, and recordings. And there are a couple systems in the FDA to do that. We're opting to use what's called an IT community structure. It has 4 tiers to it. A capability to absorb or accept any information source and make it accessible by overlay of middleware, what they call middleware. A way to manage the data, a way to analyze the data, which is where you can put tools that you prefer to use and analyze the data. And the last one, and the most difficult one, this is the data, any kind of data coming in, is leadership. Because again, once all of us produce our results of this is the problem, now the leader has to make a decision in FDA that's not quite as simple. And I'll give you an example. If you were to look at the most deadly drug on the market right now that causes fatalities, it's Tylenol. So when you put information up in front of that person about, say, Tylenol, should it be taken off the market, one aspect that we would tell them is, there are at least 16,000 people killed by this drug. But the other one is that, in terms of benefit, there are 32 million people who benefit in a number of different ways from the drug. The third one would be there's a legislative mandate that this particular drug be made available for a number of different reasons. So they're synthesizing different kinds of information. And as we do all of our IT integration, we have to think at that level as well, not just analysis. And we're just beginning to look at that right now. So 4 points going back to something that was mentioned in the National Academy of Science. Convergence of information sources is going to be important. The question is how to do it and which ones to associate. What solutions will be best for taking advantage of convergence of information? each information source has value. The question is just understanding what it tells you. Each information source has its own problems. We have to recognize, though, that not all information sources are equal. They do have a valid contribution to the decision that you make. In many respects, we're sort of recreating how a compound eye in an insect works. Several thousand different organelles that assemble a three-dimensional picture. We're doing the same thing. So just go back to, this is a representation of some of the information sources. There are quite a few to use. And open your mind about other information sources that I haven't listed here that could be important for either what we do or for what you do. And lastly, always remember FDA, there's only one thing we do. We look for clusters and patterns of problems. And our problem is being able to distinguish between these figures. Now, incidentally, trying to do the programming to make this distinction at an 85% accuracy probably require several hundred lines of code. And even then, it wouldn't be reliable. So what we do in an instant would take a computer several years. Now, the question is why? Remember that our reliance on IT, we have to be very careful about it, because there's only two things a computer can do: yes or no. So, an example, if you're to program how to distinguish these two, everybody has two eyes. Well, yes, everybody has two eyes, they're the same. And you say, well, you know, they have long ears. Okay. Well, 3 out of the 4 have long ears. So, yes, they're all the same. So you recognize there's a lot of different things you have to do in programming to eliminate different issues or identify certain issues, and it's not particularly easy. I want to thank the team, because this is a group effort. It truly is a transdisciplinary group with people like Asaya, who just recently has started collaborating with us. There's IT specialists, analysts, myself, a clinician, and as a group, we generate more than we could individually. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Francis. So at this time, we got time for some questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, just please raise your hand, and Sayak will bring you the microphone. So well, I'll start then. That's a question. So within the sort of enterprise architecture and framework that you showed earlier, which parts of the system do you think are sort of most mature and well-developed, and where are the areas that are sort of most opportune for further development?
Well, I think they all can require some development. Remember, the use case would be the FDA, where it's very heavy on security of data. So that's a part that's really weak right now, even though there are federal descriptions of what we should do for cloud operations. We have to remember that the data that we hold within FDA can collapse an industry in a little bit less than 24 hours. I'm talking about multi-billion-dollar companies. So, for example, if an opposing company was able to get the information that someone else's drug didn't work and knew why, they could have a tremendous advantage in doing what they need to do in the future. So for us, a lot of it is security. The second issue is not necessarily all the machinery, because that's always going to evolve about every 15 months by a Moore's law, but the people who use it. Because if you think about it, the people who are most effective at using these kinds of things are not specialists per se, but have a little bit more utilitarian capability, and they understand some IT. They may not know SaaS or something like that, but they recognize that it's important. And they bring to it expertise that with a right kind of IT insight will generate things that really can work very well. Now, there are a lot of examples, but we don't realize it. Outside of FDA, if you look at the most effective synthesis of IT expertise and statistical capability, it is derivative traders. If you look at the early derivative traders, they were all Bayesian statisticians, but they recognized how to take advantage of the statistical analysis to see patterns in computational data that was coming out of the market. And there are a lot of different issues like that. And that's what we should all aspire to. Now, outside of the federal system, people are trained to do that kind of stuff. And those are the people that earn $200,000 and $300,000 a year. Complex data analytics.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Francis, let me give you a hypothetical, right? And then ask you to maybe look out into the future. So, to the extent that the FDA starts basing drug approval decisions or making conclusions about drug safety on the basis of social media data, What is your sense for the appetite of legislators to believe those findings?
Well, you asked 3 questions in there, so let me break them apart. One is, what's the value of social media in regulatory decision-making inside FDA?
Right.
2, what's the value of social media for decision-making for the people who produce the drugs outside FDA?
Right.
And 3, the legislative accountability and understanding the motivation of people who do the legislation.
Right.
First, internally, I would not look at social media as an isolated information source. You know, for a lot of things that we do for drug approval and for surveillance, are going to be in the safety area. And there are a lot of information sources that will tell us a lot about safety signals. Spontaneous reports are very good for severe and sudden. Looking at natural language processing of published literature is good for what they call marginal signals. Social media is for big, bad, and ugly, that kind of thing. So it's in isolation internally, it's not a unique information source that we make a decision on. It just add to a number of different things we evaluate. Industry is a much more complicated question. It goes into the realm of policy, in that there's now legal liability that's implied when something is talked about in a public forum. As far as I know, and I'm no expert in that area, there's been no resolution of what to do with that information, but it's an area of great concern. And then the third part is legislative issues. Remember, for FDA lives in a relatively complicated consortium of different concerns. There's pharma, whose only reason to be is to make money. You have legislatures, whose real reason is to make sure that their constituents get what they need, which is to make money. And then there's the science, where we have to look at the data and see if all these things are synergistic, and if not, be willing to make a regulatory decision that will actually cost, there's a reason FDA is always in the news, and that we have to make decisions based on the science. It's reproducible, but it affects those other two. So I haven't seen a lot of publications about legislative issues around social media, but I'm not the expert to ask about that. You know, there might be others who can give you more information on it. But for analytic purposes, it's one of many information sources.
Thank you.
One question?
Thank you for your presentation. My questions are 2 parts. The first one is the rapid users. I mean, if it's a mobile app, could you give us some description on their user characteristic and who are actually using this app? And my second question is, I know FDA have some other kind of surveillance going on, like FARS or Sentinel project, and how would the mobile health information complement those surveillance information?
Okay. In terms of Rapid itself, it was a prototype that we're talking about. We started the production version in about 2 weeks. What we noticed in, especially in the user acceptability testing about the mobile device itself, is it depends on who you're asking information from. So it was designed in the prototype to get it from health professionals, mainly because they knew the issues and they know the language. So the system right now is programmed for people who know medical issues. However, in the speech-to-text version, it has a couple of ways to switch out the language, so you can look at medically specific language, and then it will do the typing, or general conversational language and do the same thing. Now, the problem with doing it from the general population reporting is they don't speak in medical terms, so there's a mapping issue of when someone says sleepy, what does that mean, and how would I evaluate it? And the reason I picked sleepy was that several years ago, it was a drug that in the reports, it had a lot of sleepy patients. They were having petit mal seizures, but we had to figure that out through other information sources. So that's where multiple information sources can be helpful in getting an idea of what the common language term means. And you'd be amazed at the number of ways people use language who are not medical, and probably medical as well. Now, the second part of the question is mobile health and other kinds of information sources. Now, it has a place, but if you say take a Sentinel as an example, what you're looking at is a consortium of 17 medical centers who do not share the personally identifiable information that we analyze. So it sends it to a center, it's aggregated, and we get a result about 2 weeks later. So in terms of the capabilities that a mobile phone-based operation would help with, the Sentinel system is not geared to do that yet, though they're looking at it. There is that capability, but there's a lot of issues around patient privacy, the HIPAA rules, which regulate, what medical information can be transmitted. We're trying to sort those out now. Did I answer your question? Okay. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Francis, for a nice presentation. It was a little difficult to see some of the very busy slides,
Yeah.
so we look forward to receiving them after the fact. Social media is a data source, and in terms of using social media as a future component to conduct observational studies, you alluded to in a very peripheral way that this data source may not necessarily dovetail or jive or be part of the Sentinel or many Sentinel type of paradigm, but the issue is not so much only with regard to the FDA, but also EMA, and now Japan's crawling into the same space as well.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speculate, do you have some ideas as to how to imbue this or imbibe this into the model that we are using? These things are already being done by both the regulators and many pharmaceutical companies, but the issue is how to make meaning out of it, and can this be used for observational studies?
Well, I think as you pointed out, people are looking at it now. We've actually talked to a number of different companies that are looking at different ways to take advantage of it. I think as time will tell how useful it is. Where I have seen it most useful in the social media world is people who are in the virtual populations. For example, if you're looking at addictive drugs as an example, there's a website, arrowwood.org, which has a very scientific way of looking at all the drugs of abuse in the United States. And in that group, they can do surveillance of their own groups and tell you a little bit about what happens with populations when they're exposed to drugs that are used in a diversion kind of way, that kind of thing. So I see provable outcomes there. I think the problem gets more complicated when you get into general surveillance. Now, it might be useful in Japan. You have a relatively homogeneous population. It's much smaller in the United States, and the spectrum of disease is a little bit different. So I think it has capability, but it depends on the circumstance within which you use it. Now, for me, like I said at the beginning, I have to do it in the context of FDA. We're looking at the United States for the most part, 350 million people, a lot of different characteristics to make it unique compared to Japan or other groups. But it doesn't mean that it's not useful. It's just, what's the question? What does the data tell you in that particular circumstance? And I think that's part of what we have to look at. I don't have the ground truth for everything. All I can tell you is the patterns that we see so far, and you hear other experts talk about it as well. I think there is a future for it, but we have to recognize there's patient privacy issues in there. And in the information that we use, what are our responsibilities in using information that were not intended to be used for making decisions? So there's a lot of other things in there that are non-scientific per se, but have to be accounted for.
Great. With that, let's close this keynote session. So thank you, Dr. Francis.